Hello and welcome to this Weimar Germany Part 2 revision video. Now hopefully you've already completed the Part 1 video and you've seen all about the foundation of the Weimar Republic and what it was like during the crisis years of 1918 to 1923. This particular video is going to pick up where we left off and think about the golden years between 1924 to 1929, and you're going to be deciding to what extent was it actually deserving of the name the golden years. We're also going to be thinking about why did the Weimar Republic collapse in 1933, including how and why Hitler became Chancellor. All the information in this PowerPoint has been taken directly from the revision guide that you have in your folders. So all this information is in there. It's up to you if you have it open whilst you're watching it or if you're just going to use the information that is on the screen. If you are using it, you're going to need page 7 onwards. If you haven't already made a revision material about Stresemann and the so-called golden years, then it's really important that you make one as you're watching this video. Now, if you are going to make a revision clock, we've got 12 headings here that you should use, one for each segment. And even if you're just doing a spider diagram on some A3 paper, then you can still use these to structure your notes. Now, personally, I would use these as the 12 headings because they encompass everything, but the video doesn't quite go in a perfect order. So what you'll notice is on each slide, I'll have put which box out of these 12 it should go in. So it might start, for instance, with box 1, but there are various points where it jumps around. So it might be worth pausing the video here and writing those headings down just so that you've got it for ease later on. In order to understand how successful Stresemann was, we need to just recap and remind ourselves about the problems that he was facing when he first became Chancellor in 1923. Now, he was facing enormous economic, political and international problems as well. In terms of economic problems, when he became Chancellor in August 1923, Germany was experiencing hyperinflation, where the value of the currency had drastically declined. For instance, a loaf of bread ended up costing 200 billion marks by the time we get to the summer of 1923. There was also a strike going on in the Ruhr industrial area once the French had invaded, and there wasn't any production taking place at that time. Germany was generally struggling to pay reparations, which is what had actually caused the invasion of the Ruhr and hyperinflation. Politically, there were also lots of problems that Germany was experiencing. First of all, the Weimar governments were often seen as weak by many people. They were hated generally for signing things like the Treaty of Versailles and also agreeing to pay reparations from 1921. In reality, those politicians didn't have much choice, but still they were blamed by the vast majority of people. They also had to deal with 3 major political rebellions: the Spartacus Uprising in January 1919, the Kapp Putsch in March 1920, and the Munich Putsch in November 1923 as well. So they generally struggled with the political situation. Finally, there were some international problems with Germany's reputation abroad. Germany was no longer a world power and they were seen as an international outcast. For instance, they weren't even allowed to join the League of Nations. And relations with France were so bad that the French had actually invaded the Ruhr in January 1923 to try and extract those reparations by force. Pause the video here to make some notes in the first box of your revision clock. So the situation before Stresemann was pretty bleak. However, under Stresemann there was recovery, and he's seen as being one of the national saviours of Germany. Now Stresemann, this man that we can see here, is a centre-right German politician and was part of a political party called the DVP. He's a man that is credited with starting the so-called golden age of Weimar Germany, which is from the end of the crisis years towards the end of 1923 all the way up to his death in 1929, and he dies just before the Great Depression starts. He's credited with ending those crisis years because of his decisive action. I'm going to see how he does things like, for instance, introducing a new currency in Germany. He does that while he's Chancellor for a short period of time in 1923. He's actually only Chancellor for 12 weeks, but during that time he managed to end hyperinflation and the Munich Putsch as well. He then became Foreign Minister at the end of 1923, and he was in that position until he died in 1929. This is the role he's best known for. Pause the video here to make some notes in box 2 of your revision clock. The first area we're going to look at is the extent of political recovery, and these notes are going to go in box 3 and box 4 of your revision clocks. Now, first of all, we know that there had been massive problems with political rebellions and a dislike for Weimar democracy during the so-called crisis years. But under Stresemann, there wasn't actually any more political uprisings. Also, there have been 376 political assassinations that had taken place between 1919 and 1923. And again, in this period of 1924 to 1929, there are no political assassinations. So actually, there has been a major change and there are some real positives with this. Not only that, but Stresemann was a great political leader who was able to organise the most effective coalition they ever had, called the Grand Coalition of Political Parties, and this was around between 1928 and 1930. In this coalition, they had 5 major parties working together and cooperating under the leadership of Stresemann and also a man that was Chancellor called Müller. Now, as a result of this, groups like the Nazis and other extremist parties found it very difficult to get support because people felt that their government had become more effective. So, as a result, Nazis only get 12 seats in the 1928 elections, which is such a small percentage of the vote because it's only 2.6% of it. Generally in this period, people were happier with their government than they had been during the crisis years. And that's because of lots of different reasons, like political and economic stability, but also the fact that they were introducing lots of welfare reforms to try and help people too. For instance, they built 3 million new homes in this period. Now, there are lots of positives, and there are lots of pieces of evidence that suggest there had been political recovery, but there were still some lingering negatives as well, and some things that hadn't been fully solved. Some historians talk about the fact that it only looked stable on the surface, and they talk about the fact that democracy collapsed quite quickly after the start of the Great Depression. Think about how Hitler became Chancellor in 1933 and basically destroyed democracy from within. That is because there were lots of people that still were very right-wing and very nationalist. So despite the fact that extremist parties like the Nazis aren't getting votes, there was still this strong underlying trend of nationalism where people hated the Republic for signing the Treaty of Versailles. The legacy of that and the stab in the back myth doesn't just go away, it's not as obvious as it was during the crisis years. Some historians talk about the Weimar Republic being a republic without republicans. Basically, they didn't have the support of the people. Even their politicians didn't always believe in democracy. For instance, if we think about President Hindenburg, who was the president between 1925 until he died in 1934, and he was Germany's last president in this period, he abused Article 48, and between 1930 and 1934, there was basically no laws passed through the Reichstag itself. So even the person that is in charge of this democratic system isn't necessarily a big supporter of democracy. So how could it really succeed in the long term if even the leaders don't necessarily care that much about its ideals? Pause the video here to make notes in box 3 and 4 of your revision clocks. We're carrying on thinking about the extent of political recovery, but now we're going to be thinking about the Nazi Party in the golden years. Now remember, at the end of the crisis years in November 1923, Hitler had been arrested for his involvement in the Munich Purge. He'd been sentenced to go to prison for 5 years, but only served 9 months. And this is an image here of Hitler in prison. Now, some historians see the Stresemann years, the so-called golden years, as a time of setback and failure for the Nazi Party. And there are some negatives for them in this period. For instance, Hitler was not allowed to speak in public until the year 1927, and also people weren't really listening to the Nazi ideas of hate and blame, because when people were doing better off in terms of the economy, they found those messages less appealing. As a result, Nazis only got 12 seats in the 1928 elections. Now, generally people think that they were waiting for bad times. They needed people to be upset then support them. So some historians say that this actually wasn't a time of failure, but was actually a time of consolidation, when Hitler was preparing his party for an opportunity to win power, when he was waiting for bad times that would make their ideas more appealing. So, for instance, we can see with the amount of people in the Nazi Party, it had gone from about 27,000 in 1925 to 100,000 in 1928. So even though they were doing badly in terms of the share of the vote, we can still see that they did have a fair amount of supporters. During this period as well, Hitler was able to secure the help of rich backers in both Germany and America. People like Ford ended up funding some of the Nazi propaganda, as we'll talk about later. Now, Hitler already had a group of people called the SA, the Stormtroopers, brown shirts, that he had founded basically in 1920. However, in this period, he also sets up the SS, and they wore black shirts. Now, they started originally as Hitler's personal bodyguard, but later on, they became much more than that, and they had many different roles in the Nazi state. For instance, they're the ones that had done things like running concentration camps. Hitler also made sure that he would create youth organisations, and he created the Hitler Youth for boys and the BDM, the League of German Maidens, for girls. He also put this man, Joseph Goebbels, in charge of propaganda and even controlled 2 newspapers. So you've got to make a decision for yourself about whether you think the Nazis used this period and whether they were still a threat or not. But no matter what you think, I'd like you to make some notes in box 5 of your revision clock.
We're now going to look at the economic recovery in Germany, again looking at the positives and the negatives. Let's start with the positives. First of all, we know that in 1923 hyperinflation was a huge issue and basically money had become worthless. We know that Stresemann needed to deal with this immediately. Some of the things that he did were quite unpopular. So, for example, sacking public employees or cutting the salaries of others became really unpopular, but it did help to reduce the expenditure of the country. He also reorganised railways and post offices so that they became more profitable. On top of that, and probably one of the really important points, is that he called in the old worthless marks that have been destroyed by hyperinflation. And instead, he introduced a new currency called the Rentenmark. And this was vital in creating economic stability, and of course, prices would be able to stabilise again after this. He also called off the general strike in the Ruhr. This basically again made him very unpopular. It kept production going in Germany again, and it got the workers back to work. This, of course, was really important for the economy. And actually, all of these things together led to a gradual recovery in the economy from 1924 to 29. Remember, the impact of hyperinflation, of course, was kind of being felt in 1923. And so by 1924, once obviously the old worthless marks had been brought in and the Rentenmark was established, the strike was called off, things could then gradually improve throughout time. Another key strength was that he also created lots of kind of pacts or plans with Americans. So, for example, the Dawes Plan. Now, the Dawes Plan was set up in 1924. Now, the Dawes Plan, of course, would help to pay reparations. It was basically about reducing the annual reparation payments so that Germany found it easier to pay off. And also, it arranged for 100 million marks to be loaned from America to Germany. Now, of course, this was important because it meant that Germany could then use this loan to help pay off reparations, but also to build new factories, and they could invest in better infrastructure. This, of course, was going to benefit Germany itself, but also help to stabilise the position they were in with reparations. Now, on top of that, the Young Plan was also signed and created in 1929. This was really important because one of the issues, of course, with the Dawes Plan is that it was based on loans, whereas the Young Plan was about reducing the total amount of reparations. Rather than paying 6.6 billion, the Germans were actually expected to pay 1.8 billion. So it massively reduced the cost of reparations. And on top of that, they extended the final deadline by another 59 years. Remember, they originally had 66 years to pay off, but this gave them an extension. The final positive is that there was proof of economic recovery. For example, the economy was growing at 4% a year, and production and exports were also almost double their 1924 level. That is evidence and factual statistics to state that there was clearly some economic recovery in Germany. However, we've got to look at the negatives as well. One of the negatives is, of course, the fact that Stresemann didn't manage to get back the money that was lost from hyperinflation. There would still be a lot of people in Germany that resented the government for losing their savings. Let's not forget those people that have been saving and everything became worthless after hyperinflation. That money was never recovered. Another negative is that, things like the Dawes Plan were really good in the short term. Actually, meant that Germany was entirely dependent on foreign loans. This was dangerous. You've got to think, guys, when the economy collapses after the Great Depression and the Americans call back in the 800 million mark loan, that means that the Germans are going to be stuck in a really difficult position because they are basically going to have to be suffering with the cost of the cut off of trade, but on top of that, they're also going to have to pay back the money that they owe to the Americans. Stresemann was aware, of course, that this was an issue, and Stresemann actually stated that they were dancing on the edge of a volcano. Now, what that suggests is that things were looking pretty good because they were dancing, but they're on the edge of a volcano. They could slip at any point. And of course, we know that Paul Stresemann, of course, does die in 1929, the same year that the Great Depression breaks out. And so, of course, that's when Germany is left in a really dire situation. The next section of our work is going to be looking at the extent of international recovery. So first of all, it's important we recognise the position that Germany was in before 1924. There's a couple of key things, the loss of the war, for example, in 1918, signing the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, of course, meant that they had quite a difficult relationship with Allied powers. Also, not being invited into the League of Nations when it was set up in 1920 was a big issue as well, because it meant that that was a winners' club and that Germany is excluded from being a world power. Now, in 1924, Stresemann, of course, hoped to improve Germany's international position and to build better relationships with the Allies, particularly as they've been worsened by the invasion of the Ruhr. So in 1924, he first obviously agrees to the Dawes Plan. Now, part of the Dawes Plan, we've already talked about that giving obviously a loan of 800 million from the USA. But another key point within the Dawes Plan was that it stated that the Ruhr had to be evacuated by the Allied troops. So British troops left in 1926. The French troops did remain there until 1930, but I suppose it does mean that more Allied troops are leaving the Ruhr, and it did begin to stabilise relations with the Allies, especially because reparations were able to be paid again after the loan from the Dawes Plan as well. So the Dawes Plan was really significant in definitely improving international recovery as well as economic recovery as well. In 1925 as well, the Locarno treaties were signed. Now, this was really, really important because Germany was basically agreeing to stick to the territorial terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, we know that the Treaty of Versailles in Germany was known as a diktat because it was forced upon the German people. But with the Locarno treaties, it was signed willingly and voluntarily. And this is where basically Stresemann is proving that Germany could be trusted again and that they were ready to move on from the war. And this, of course, was influential in letting them into the League of Nations. Once the League of Nations obviously invited Germany to join, this was then seen as a great, great success. Stresemann actually regarded it as his greatest achievement. Now, once Germany, of course, was accepted into the League of Nations, they became a world power again. In fact, Germany actually became one of the leading members of the League of Nations. In 1928, we also can think about the fact that the Kellogg-Briand Pact was signed. This was basically where Stresemann signed with 65 other nations to say that no countries, including Germany, would use force to resolve their disputes. This was really, really important because, again, it helped nations to trust Germany, especially as they were one of the first to sign this pact and said they were not willing to use violence. Instead, they would go to the League of Nations if they had any issues at all. The final section we need to look at is 1929, where Stresemann basically negotiated the Young Plan. The Young Plan, of course, we know helped the economy, but actually it also led to the French finally leaving the Ruhr. And of course, by cutting reparations drastically, it helped Germany to pay off their reparations more easily, and this would also help to ease relations with the Allies. If reparations were being paid, it also showed that Germany was willing to keep moving forward with that as well. So actually, Stresemann was really successful in his international recovery. There are lots of great improvements here. This was probably, for me, his greatest area of success because, of course, getting into the League of Nations meant that Germany would be seen as a leading power again. Of course, it's after 1929 and obviously the movement towards the rise of Hitler, and that's when obviously Germany kind of falls out of position with the Allies and comes out of the League of Nations in 1933. So that's where things begin to go badly. But I would say that in the years 1924 to 29, the international recovery is really strong. Okay, so we're going to move on to the last section for the golden years now, looking at culture and whether that developed in Weimar Germany. So we're going to start by looking at the positives and the negatives. So let's look at the positives first of all and think about why there were clear developments in the cultural golden age. So first of all, it is known that the Weimar Republic was seen as a time of cultural innovation for a number of different reasons. And the bullet points here just demonstrate the reasons why Weimar is seen as a time of cultural innovation. So the first bit is about developing architecture. So we've got the Bauhaus architecture that's particularly quite prominent in the Weimar period. And this is where architecture just completely changes and we begin to see more functional, I suppose, practical forms of architecture as opposed to more decorative. We also begin to see differences in art. So, for example, Grothendieck's are more modern artists and they depict particular pictures that were quite controversial about World War I and showing images about soldiers not being heroic but being perhaps damaged from the war in some way, one way or another. And this was, of course, criticised by more right-wing groups who did not feel that this was respectful towards those that had fought in the war. The third one is looking at the German film industry, which is actually the largest in Europe. And then we've also got the fourth point about how Germany was famous for its quite liberal and modern attitudes. So, for example, in Germany, you could go to nightclubs, you could watch cabarets, and within these cabarets, they quite often had a lot of open sexuality. So this often meant open homosexuality as well. So, for example, you might have the presence of gay people within these cabarets, and quite often as well, the plays were more left-wing in their views and sometimes criticised right-wing government, right-wing groups, or mocked the past under the Kaiser and things like that. So again, more traditional people would see this as quite inappropriate and decadent, and they perhaps wouldn't have enjoyed this movement towards more modern and liberal attitudes. The final section is about how there was also a bit of an anti-war sentiment. I've already talked about that kind of being present in modern art, but also within the book by Remarques, who basically had written the book called All Quiet on the Western Front. Now, this book was published in 1929, and it basically was about criticising World War I. So again, that wouldn't really appeal to those people that wanted to glorify war in some way. So they're the positives about how, I mean, to be honest, overall, it's about seeing culture as being more open-minded, it's much more modern, and that is generally how things began to change. I think there's also a real difference for women, particularly when it comes to, like, you know, we talked about the open sexuality, for example, in cabarets. That was particularly for women as well, who became more sexualised, wearing different outfits and wearing their hair shorter and things like that. And I suppose that kind of comes in line with some other changes at the time, such as, you know, women getting the right to vote and having more rights to an education and a career and things like that. So that kind of falls hand in hand. The negatives of the cultural golden age then is mostly just about the fact that many Germans, of course, were still right-wing, and so especially the right-wing organisations like the Nazis, they regarded Weimar culture as incredibly decadent and immoral, and therefore, I suppose, although these cultural changes are seen as innovative and a step towards modern society, it certainly divided German people at the time, because some people liked these changes and some people certainly didn't approve of them, and that's one of the reasons when we get into Nazi Germany, we begin to see a reversal of these cultural changes.
Well done for getting to the end of the video on Stresemann. What you might want to do is pause here and just make sure that you can answer all 11 questions about Stresemann and that you're confident in that knowledge. The answers are on the next slide. For the answers, you might want to just check what you've got against these.